Identify stakeholders is the process of identifying project stakeholders regularly and analyzing and documenting relevant information regarding their interests, involvement, interdependencies, influence, and potential impact on project success. This process is performed periodically throughout the project as needed, but should be started as early as possible. By performing this process, the project team is able to identify the appropriate focus for engagement of each stakeholder or group of stakeholders. Inputs to this process include the project management plan. The communications management plan is a source of knowledge about project stakeholders. Obviously, communications and stakeholder engagement are going to be very closely linked. The stakeholder engagement plan tells us about the strategies and actions required to effectively engage our stakeholders. While project documents may not exist yet for initial stakeholder identification, as we iteratively perform it throughout the project, we may want to go ahead and consider the change log. Any change requests that had been approved may bring about new stakeholders or change impacts to existing stakeholders. The issue log records issues that may introduce new stakeholders to the project or change the type of participation of existing stakeholders. And requirements documentation provides information on potential stakeholders based upon what they may have requested to have as a part of the project. With agreements, if our project is a result of a procurement activity, then the parties to the contract are key stakeholders. Some tools and techniques that we may use in this process. Data gathering, we can use questionnaires and surveys. So perhaps meeting with people in small groups, in focus group sessions, or some other type of mass information collection. Brainstorming and brainwriting are more creativity techniques that we can use in order to ensure that we're capturing as many stakeholders as possible as early as possible. Data analysis refers to both document analysis as we assess the available documentation and lessons learned, because past similar projects may have stakeholders that are still relevant to our project now. With the stakeholder analysis, we're going to look at our list of stakeholders and start evaluating them based upon a number of criteria. So it could be based upon their interest, their rights, ownership, knowledge, and contribution to the project overall. Data representation is how we can visually depict the stakeholders and various levels of attributes for them. We can use various methods to represent this information, such as a matrix, a stakeholder cube, a salience model, or any other representation that your organization may have. On this slide, we see an example of data representation. This is a stakeholder cube. This model combines grid elements into a three-dimensional model and can be useful to project managers and teams in identifying and engaging their stakeholders. Direction of influence refers to the stakeholder's ability to influence the work of the project or the project team itself. When we describe upward influence, this is the senior management of the project or the sponsor and steering committee. With downward influence, this is a team or specialist contributing knowledge or skills in a temporary capacity. Outward influence is the stakeholder groups and their representatives outside of the project team. So think about your suppliers, government representatives, or the end users. While sideward influence is the peers of the project manager, such as other project managers or middle managers who are in competition for scarce resources. Prioritization will be necessary. We will identify many stakeholders, but obviously we will have to limit our attention to key stakeholders. These are the people with the highest level of influence, power, or interest. On this slide, we see an example of a salience model. Here we can compare three different attributes simultaneously. To give an operational definition for these, power would be the ability of a stakeholder to impose their will onto a project. Legitimacy would be the appropriateness of the use of that power. Urgency is the overall neediness of the stakeholders. There'd be at least one definitive stakeholder within the project, and that will be the sponsor. They obviously have some power if they were able to start the project. And obviously the use of that power would be legitimate as, well, they sponsored the project. And they demonstrated a level of urgency because they wanted to start the project. Outputs from this process include the stakeholder register. The level of detail should be defined as part of the stakeholder management plan. It should include identification information, so who is a stakeholder, what organization do they work for, what role are they in, and how do we get in touch with them. Any assessment information that we have. What expectations do they have? What is their relative level of influence or interest? And how would we classify them? Are they internal or external to our organization? Their overall attitude, positive or negative? And what direction of influence do they have? Change requests could also be an output of this process. These change requests could modify any aspect of the project management plan or its component plans. This could be based upon new stakeholders or changing needs of existing stakeholders. Further outputs from this process include project documents updates, such as the assumptions log. So if we have more information about the relative power, interest, and engagement of stakeholders, this information is going to be assumptions. There's no easy way to quantify these types of things. So when we do enter this into the assumptions log, we want to put down exactly how did we arrive at these conclusions. Any issues that may arise should be recorded as well, and any new risks identified during the process should be recorded in the risk register. Identify stakeholders. Learning assessment. Describe the purpose of this process in your own words. We're trying to see who will be affected by the project and who should be providing requirements. What is the best definition of a stakeholder? A stakeholder is anyone whose interests are positively or negatively affected by the project. When should this process occur? This process should occur at the outset, but is ongoing due to the fact that stakeholders may come and go. What are some of the various ways we can depict classifications of stakeholders? We could depict them using power interest, power influence, or interest influence grids, salience models, and stakeholder cubes. What types of things may happen if we don't properly perform this process? If we don't properly perform this process, we can miss key requirements or have the project threatened by stakeholders who are not identified. Each time the identification of stakeholders is repeated, what documents should be consulted to identify relevant project stakeholders? The project management plan components and project documents should be consulted. Why is it appropriate to have the project management plan as an input here, even though we are in the initiating process group? Since initiating is not a phase and not constraining us to sequence, we can plan before we identify new stakeholders, or we can circle back mid-project and identify new stakeholders as they come and go.